No sound. Aha, never mind. Okay. I am not sure what is up with today, but there aren't a lot of y'all here today. So I will give everybody here and the, oh shoot, I didn't take a good picture. Hold on, gotta go back. Aha, people are coming in, so. All right. But I had already started to say it, so I will finish saying it. I will give the ones that are here 3 points for actually showing up on Monday. And the ones that are online, because they were here, technically. Usually this is a little later when it's like we have the first really cold, wet day. But y'all been doing, I say that. Actually, by this time of the semester, this is usually about the average class size. It's dropped down to about here. But then the first really cold and wet days, then I miss a lot of people. I guess I've just gotten used to y'all always. Y'all are like, this has been one of the best classes are showing up. So y'all are doing good. No, I gotta figure out from current slide. Okay, I gotta be smarter with the computer, and I'm not today. Unless something goes drastically wrong, we will be done with the American Revolution today, which means you will have a test. And the test will be open at least until class time on Wednesday, when I'll remember that I didn't close it. So you'll have today and tomorrow. You do need to read. There's a lot of stuff on this test, little detailed stuff about maybe those Hessians that they talked about in the cartoon that was surprised on Christmas Day. Might be on the test. The Hessians were British soldiers, but they were mercenaries. They were soldiers for hire. We didn't get into that because we didn't get too deeply into the details of the battle. But when we stopped, the two sides were meeting up in the south. In December of 1780, Cornwallis joined Benedict Arnold at Petersburg, Virginia, with 7,200 men. At this point, Benedict Arnold is now on the other side. Benedict Arnold is, that's like synonymous with traitor in the United States. He was an ambitious man. He was actually very loyal in the beginning to the revolution, but due to some jealousies of who was promoted, feelings of getting looked over, an ambitious, expensive wife who had ideals higher than what his pay rate was, he decided that selling the British secrets and giving them access to West Point, of which he was in charge at the time, was a good idea. It was not. He managed to not get hung, but his cohort, from whom they found out all of this information, did get caught, spilled his guts, and then was hung. Benedict Arnold went on the run, joined the other side. So now, Benedict Arnold is with Cornwallis at Yorktown, or at Petersburg in Virginia. Americans are sending reinforcements to Yorktown. Yorktown was chosen by Cornwallis because he thought it would be easily defendable. Yorktown is right on the coast of Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay area. You can escape by sea, but there's really only a couple of ways to get at it by land. He was confident that the sea would be held by the British Navy, although that new American Navy was starting to get kind of annoying. And he thinks that Washington is tied up in New York. And Washington was headed for New York, or was in New York. Earlier in July, the French had landed troops at Newport, about 6,000 of them. And they just kind of sat there. There was no real plan. Early in 81, Washington convinces the French to join him in an attack on New York. So that was the plan. So late 80, early 81, Washington is going to attack New York. But before the attack happened, the news came that the Admiral de Grasse, a French admiral, with a French ship with 3,000 French troops was headed for the Chesapeake Bay region. So, change of plans. We're going to head south. That's where Cornwallis is. On August 30, de Grasse reaches Yorktown, defeats the British Navy in Chesapeake Bay. So now Cornwallis is basically surrounded. As de Grasse is sailing, the soldiers are marching. They have 16,000 combined troops that lay siege to Yorktown on September 24th. Cornwallis doesn't last very, very long. On October 17th, Cornwallis sues for peace, and 7,000 redcoats march out to the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," which for the British it most certainly was. Cornwallis claimed he was too ill to present his sword himself, and sails back to England. The war is over. You can actually find that tune on YouTube. It's really kind of, it's okay. The cartoon was better. So, the war's over. Now what? Well, you gotta negotiate. On February 27th, 1782, which is almost a year later, well, from October to February, the House of Commons votes against continuing the war. On March 20th, Port Lord North is finally allowed. Nope, went too far. We're missing a slide. Okay. No, we're not. This is where we're supposed to be. Lord North finally gets to resign, and the Continental Congress names John Adams, who is in the Netherlands, John Jay, who is in Spain, and Benjamin Franklin, who is in Paris, to converge together and negotiate. I believe they all meet up in Paris. John Adams was kind of an odd choice. I think he was chosen mostly because he was already in Europe, but John Adams didn't like John Jay. He didn't like Benjamin Franklin. He's kind of a negative person, but he's there. And the big question ends up being something totally unrelated to the American Revolution. I mean, it's a given that the British are going to have to recognize independence. And it's a given that the French are going to get some land back. But the big question ends up revolving around Gibraltar. The Spanish want Gibraltar back. Now, if you remember, the Spanish joined the war as an ally of France, not as an ally of the United States. We don't really give a rip who gets Gibraltar. Not a big deal to us. But the French are bound to support Spain. And this leads to an issue where John Jay is very fearful that the French are going to seek a separate peace. Now, the Treaty of Alliance that brought the French into the war said that neither side would seek peace without the other. That's important. But John Jay thinks the French are going to go after a separate peace treaty in order to get Spain what it wants. And he convinces Franklin to beat them to the punch and go ahead and make a treaty with the British without the French, which is not a good diplomatic move as far as alliances go, but it's what we did. So on November 30th, 1782, a preliminary treaty was negotiated with Great Britain. It's again called the Treaty of Paris. There's a lot of treaties of Paris. If you remember, the Treaty of Paris is what ended the French and Indian War. So now we have a second Treaty of Paris. It was signed on September 3rd, 1783. Great Britain recognizes American independence with Mississippi as the western boundary. The northern and southern boundaries were vague, but Spain got Florida back. So now Florida is Spanish once again. The British grant American fishing rights off of Newfoundland and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which allows them to dry their catch on the unsettled Atlantic coast of Canada. That means absolutely nothing to us today. But as fishing was a huge industry at the time, and apparently you have to dry your fish somewhere, this was a big concession. One of the bigger issues was debts. There were American merchants that owed British merchants. There were British merchants that owed American merchants, but that wasn't as big a question. And what are we going to do about all that confiscated Loyalist property that was taken? What they got was only a vague promise that merchants should meet, quote, no legal impediment, unquote, and that Congress would, quote, earnestly recommend, unquote, that the states restore confiscated Loyalist property. So maybe you'll get your money, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll get your property back. It depends on where you came from. Some of the states did, some of the states didn't. Most did not. Which, honestly, if you were a Loyalist and had been run out of the country, I'm not sure I would want to come back. I would want the money. I would want the value of my property, but I'm not sure I would want to live there. We're going to get done way early. But the revolution's over. We have a little bit more to do. I think I'm missing a slide, but y'all are just going to have to listen to me talk. They set up a government that was far different than anything anyone had ever imagined. Locke imagined it. Some philosophers had imagined it. Some political theorists had. But nobody actually thought a true republic would exist. It was a very radical idea. And it's based on the idea that this would be a nation whose citizens were deemed equal before the law and who governed themselves through elected and appointed representatives. There would be no king. There would be supposedly no class designation where you had lords that were better than other people. Everybody was equal and everybody had a role to play. It's an ideology that cherishes individual liberty and fears a centralized power. And they felt it would work as long as they had counterbalancing forces to keep everything in check. It was a very radical idea, and it was presumed that it would only survive as long as people were virtuous and placed the good of society above self-interest. Figure how long that's going to last. I mean, people are people. The state constitutions were the first political expressions of this Republican ideology. The people were sovereign, that's where the power comes from, and government authority was limited. And this shows up in these state constitutions. Most state constitutions included bills of rights, which, kind of have what we're used to, we take for granted, but this is all new. Freedom of speech, trial by jury, freedom from self-incrimination. They arrange for elected governors, senates, and councils. All of these things had at one point been appointed in the past. There's no other government in the world that elects their leaders. And all the constitutions also put a separation of powers. So lawmakers can do one thing, governors can do another, judicial branch does another, and they all balance each other out. There were more limits on governors and increased power in legislation. Why would they put more limits on governors?
Maybe because it was the first government from doing it?
Yeah. Anybody else have any ideas? What did they just fight against? They fought against the king. So we're not going to put all our power in one person. It starts out, their problem was with Parliament, but then when Paine writes Common Sense, they turn on the king. And the war becomes a fight against that tyranny. So we're not going to give a lot of power to one person. And it didn't help that immediately before the war, most of the governors were appointed by the king and had been pretty tyrannical. People tend to have knee-jerk reactions against you fight against something, you're done with it. On the federal level, you have the Articles of Confederation. That's going to be the new government. And in a sense, it just validated the status quo as far as the Continental Congress was concerned. But it did give them sort of a constitution to work with, or at least a document. They had started working on this as early as July of 1776. And finally adopted it in 1777, but they had to wait for the states to ratify it. So the document is called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. So we're a confederation of independent states that are agreeing to stay in perpetual combination. All of the states ratify it except for Maryland, because Maryland's not happy with how the Western lands are being treated. And like I said, it basically legalized the status quo. And the country was going to be called the United States of America in Congress Assembled. It had a multitude of responsibilities, but very little authority. I mean, it had all the responsibilities that a state has, that a government has. And there was not one leader. It was kind of country by committee. They it was a collective substitute for a monarch. So now we have a committee running the government. They had full power over foreign affairs and questions of war and peace. They were to decide the disputes between the states. They were to be in charge of coinage, postal service, Indian Affairs, Western Territories. There were no courts. There was no power of enforcement built into this. And most importantly, hint, hint, no power to levy taxes. So we have a federal government that cannot raise any revenue. But they have to pay for all these other things that they're supposed to be doing. And the answer to this was that all of the states would pitch in. All of the states would put in their percentage or their portion that was due. Well, they didn't do that during the war. What makes you think they're going to do it during peace? They required unanimous approval for duties on imports. They required any amendments also to be unanimous. And you had to have at least 9 states to approve measures dealing with wars, treaties, coinage, finances, the Army, or the Navy. So to get anything passed, you had to have almost 3/4 of the group in agreement, or you had to have everybody in agreement, which makes it very difficult. But they do have a governmental form. So the war's over. We've been recognized by the British. The French have already recognized us. Spain has recognized us. We're our own country. And it was a whole new place. And even within the United States, there was a change. Not only was it a physical revolution where people actually got out and fought with guns, it was a political revolution that brought forth these new ideas that nobody else had tried. But it was also a social revolution. As one person put it, the spirit of independence was converted into equality. And this was a gentleman who was sitting in a tavern, and he was actually a gentleman, well-to-do. And these farmers came in with their muddy boots and coarse ways and sat down at a table just as if they were equal to him. They fought in the war too. They were every bit as equal to him. But this is a whole new idea for people to swallow. Everybody, at least if you're male and white, is now pretty much on an equal footing socially. Now, I'm not saying that all the society and the money that makes those things different disappeared. That does still, the gentleman was still a gentleman, and if somebody had walked in and said, who has the money here, they would have looked around and they sure wouldn't have picked the farmers. You can't get rid of it that easily. But in people's minds, I'm just as good as he is. I did just as much as he did. This is my country too. Now, a lot of people got left out of this. Obviously, the slaves. They're still slaves. Now, the revolution was a great time for a slave to win their independence. And it could be done a couple of different ways. The first was to fight for the British. The British were the first to offer freedom to any black who served and fought. And they made good on that to a point. They did smuggle a lot of blacks out of the country at the end of the war. Not all of them, but a lot. Some fought on the American side and were granted their freedom that way. A lot simply took advantage of the chaos and ran away. This is a good time to go to Canada. I'm heading north. So they don't get to completely participate in the social revolution, and it was brought up. I mean, slaves did bring up the hypocrisy of a war for independence when you hold people slaves. And it was not completely lost on our founding fathers either. Women get left out. Even though Abigail Adams writes to her husband, John, and says, "Don't forget the ladies." He most certainly did. And he probably paid for that. But women don't get the equality out of this. There's one state, and I should have looked it up, I believe it's New Jersey, that doesn't quantify it in the Constitution that it's white male suffrage. They just put, landowners can vote. And for a couple of years before they could change it, women voted. They were landowners, but they fixed that. Indians don't get a fair shake in all of this. Even the ones that sided with the Americans are going to lose out. Certainly the ones that sided with the British. Now, one other area that was a big social revolution was with religion. Well, we can't have the Anglican Church anymore, so that's an obvious change. That's the Church of Britain. Anglicans switched to Episcopalians. Sorry, for a minute there, I couldn't remember it. But the churches have also undergone some radical changes throughout the war. They've added constitutions. They've added more participation. And there is no longer a state-supported church. Some of the states do write it in, but most are not at this point. So toleration takes a great upplay. And it's a cultural revolution. We're no longer British. There's a whole new group on the horizon. Those are Americans. And while everybody still at this point is going to identify more with the state that they are from, they're all Americans now. They're part of this United States of America and Congress assembled. It's a big change, and it's a lot to adapt to. And in some ways, it's overwhelming. And in other ways, it isn't, because life goes on. You still have to get up and feed everybody in the morning. The animals still want to be fed. Chores have to be done. But now you're doing them in a whole new country without ever moving. So, we are done. And it is way early. So if you leave quietly, and I will open the test before I leave, and y'all will have until Wednesday to get it done. And I would suggest get the book or find the online version, because there are some questions you might need that for. Latrice, can I talk to I was looking at the test first. These are will be our fourth major class. So we need to step it up. We probably need to start doing as much of the extra. If you do that, and if you do that, and it looks like, look, you may need a little bit of help. I don't think I should take those first two tests. But for now, let's just see if you can. Because you're here every day. She's here every day.
Missed it. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Isn't that terrible?
Do you know Trace Davidson is? Remember him?
It sounds familiar, yeah.
He said he worked on the grass.
He worked under me?
Redhead, virgin.
Yeah, yeah.
He told me to ask. I went to high school with him and I saw him the other day.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, I was like, I have references.
I hope you had good things to say.
Yeah.
Pick up.